Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra, welcoming you to another interesting discussion. Today's discussion is on the topic of Zionism. Now, a lot of times this word keeps getting bandied about or used in many discussions. Oh, this falana is a Zionist, this is Zionism, X is Zionism, Y is Zionism. We actually don't know what Zionism is all about. To be very honest, a lot of people talk about it, but a lot of people don't know about it. So I was like, you know what? Let's do a podcast with Zionism. And who better to talk about Zionism than our resident expert, Jaideep Prabhu? So, Jaideep, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jaideep, let's start with this. Can you start with the origins? So, let's start with the origin, the core of Zionism. So, what's the ideology and how did it crop up? So, go for it.
See, Kushal, that's like actually a very big question, and this is one of the complexities of Zionism. Now, in essence, Zionism is nothing other than a form of nationalism. Now, what makes it unique is that it is a nationalism of a people who are not living on the land which they are claiming. No, you'll see French nationalism. The French people live on French territory, and then they claim this is our country. Zionism is an idea of Jewish people for a Jewish state, and these people lived primarily in Europe when the idea was flourishing. So that's one thing that's very unique. So, but essentially, keep that in mind that it's sort of a nationalism. Now, what are the origins? Now, you will hear that in Jewish prayers, they have said Lashana Haba Abe Yerushalayim, like next year in Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, right? But for almost 2,000 years, they were in the diaspora. They were outside of the land, the Holy Land, and they never actually came back. So why? Now, first is that you have to understand historically that Jewish immigration to the Holy Land was controlled. The Muslims held it for the longest time. It's not like anybody could come in and live there after the Romans kicked them out. And the second thing is that the idea of having a nation state, there are a couple of factors. One is their welcome in Europe. They finally realized we cannot become Europeans no matter how hard we try. That's one thing. And this idea of nationalism in the modern sense, in the sense that a nation can have a state. Nations might be old, but each nation having its own state is a more modern idea. Back in the day, we had multinational empires. The Ottoman Empire is a great example. The Ottomans, there were Greeks and Bulgarians, and there were Turks, and they all lived, and Arabs, and they all lived in one empire, and nobody felt that we are different. So there is that progression of just political philosophy as well. And that is where the idea kicks in after the French Revolution. And even then, you'll notice that even after the French Revolution, when the idea kicked in, Jews were very resistant to move to what was then Palestine, primarily because, in my opinion, Jews went out of their way to assimilate and be part. Assimilate not in the sense of like converting and becoming part of the mainstream, but to live as a dignified community of their own within their host country. And they did their best. They said, okay, fine, maybe we'll not wear a kippah, and maybe we'll not insist on holidays on Shabbat. And they try to compromise, and they learned the French or German or Russian literature, the language, all these sorts of things. Unfortunately, despite this, they were like, every time there was like a pogrom, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and the Jews were targeted. And suddenly, towards the end of the 1800s, they realized there's nothing we can do to ensure our safety, no matter how much we try to assimilate. We cannot. These people will never accept us as one of their own, regardless of how fluently I speak their language, how well I know the history of my host country, no matter how much of their literature and philosophy and music I know. I'm always going to be seen as an outsider. So that is how the idea came. Now, here again, there's a complication. This is why I said this is a very complex question. And I'm going to give you just like this, superficial depth, because I can teach at least a year-long course on this. That's how thorny this issue is. Now, what happens is, you'll see, for example, Jews in Italy were not as persecuted. In fact, very little compared to, say, Jews in, say, Poland or Russia. The standard example is Germany, but actually the Jews in Germany, until Hitler came to power, it wasn't nearly as bad there as it was in Poland or Russia, and even France was fairly anti-Semitic. The Dreyfus Affair in the late 1890s, mid 1890s, for example. So Zionism was seen by many as a solution for the persecution faced by the Jews of Eastern Europe. So you
Okay.
ask, say a Jew living in Berlin or Paris or Rome, they'll say, yeah, we are Zionists, and for that, what that means is the Jews who are living in the Pale of Settlement, which because they're not allowed to live in like major cities, and they had their shtetls, they had like rural farms in Poland, and very few Jews might have lived in big cities like Moscow. Now, those people, because they're persecuted, they need to go to Israel. They need to have a state of their own where they can be protected, so they're not going to be persecuted. And that's what Zionism meant. Essentially, and that's the core. Now, there are many varieties of this. Like, for example, when we talk about, say, Indian nationalism or any nationalism, we might have an idea of what happens after independence. Do we want India to be a socialist country or a capitalist country or a whatever? And so, in that sense, there are differences in, and there are differences in how to achieve the independence. Gandhi wanted the satyagraha, whereas Bhagat Singh had a different idea, for example. And so these are the differences in the different kinds of Zionism. You'll hear these names like revisionist Zionism or labor Zionism, and these are the differences. But the crux of it, if you have to like boil it down to the absolute bare minimum, the one thing which if you don't have, I don't think you're a Zionist. And this is again debatable, I will point out. The one thing is that you have to believe that the Jews deserve a state of their own. The Jews should have a state of their own.
So let's expand on this particular point, because this is very important. So what is the rationale behind why Jews deserve to state on their own? It is just the persecution, because then what if people say this is a persecution complex, and that's not a valid argument, or it's more persecution but driven by a strong civilizational identity?
There is no doubt. See, there's actually a couple of months ago, I had a very fascinating conversation with a professor in Beersheba, and we were talking about Judaism, and I said, look, ultimately you are a religion, and of course around a religion a culture develops, and that's fine, but you cannot tell me that Judaism is not a religion. And they said, no, but we are more than a religion. We're not exactly a religion in the sense we don't have to believe in God. And I said, okay, explain. I mean, I understand you, and I know that faith is not important, or rather, it's not the defining feature of Judaism. You can, as long as you follow the mitzvot, the 613 mitzvot, you're fine. And descend, and if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. These sorts of things, which are again not necessarily faith-based. And he gave me a description of Judaism. And I think I shared this on Twitter also that day. I was quite not amused, piqued. My interest was certainly, stoked. And he said that the way he defined Judaism, it fits not, normally we see that Abrahamics on one side, it's revealed, it's concrete, it's fixed. And then we have a culture of Hinduism, which has religion, but it has so many other elements to it. He put Judaism closer to that, not all the way, but much closer to that than I had realized that it would fit. And I asked him, is this like a mainstream opinion? And he said, no. What happens is we use the language of Christianity. So we say religion, we say sect, we say saint. Now these words have specific connotations in Christianity, and we use them without realizing they don't fit perfectly. And we have seen this same argument made by Hindus who say we don't like this word religion because dharma is not exactly religion. It's a fair enough approximation, but not a good fit, not a perfect fit. And this is the thing with Judaism as well. So that's the first thing I will say. Is it a civilizational issue? Yes, it is a civilizational. It's not just a religious issue. It's a civilizational issue. It becomes a religious issue if you look at Judaism through a Christian lens, where they look at it as a faith-based community. I'll tell you, the Kingdom of Judah, for example, there was this enough evidence that there was idolatry, paganism, whatever you want to call it, in the Kingdom of Judah as well. Just a couple of days ago, they found a new complex outside Jerusalem where they found these things. So it's more complicated than seeing it as just like like Christianity or Islam, which are far more clearly defined compared to Judaism, at least. Nothing. Now, in terms of persecution, now this is again, like almost everything I say is going to be debated hotly. these are debates we still have. Is it a persecution complex? I don't know if it's a complex necessarily if you've been persecuted for 2000 years and not a single country has ever allowed you refuge. India is the one example. We were not even aware that we had Jews in India. They were so well, um, again, not assimilated, but they got along so well that we just many people are not aware of the Jewish presence in India even. Only now, because of social media, because of improving ties with Israel, that sort of stuff. But look at other countries, even America, which is the great diaspora for Jews. They closed their borders during World War II. England as well, and then historically in 1291, I think the English kicked out the Jews, and in 1492, I think 1494, the Spaniards kicked the Jews out, and Jews have always suffered. Now, again, the question is this: even Napoleon, for example, what he said is, he's seen as the great secular hope and all that sort of stuff in that sense. So even for him, what he said is like Jews can be, as long as they're French, you will have equal rights. And how did he define it? He said, look, you can have all the individual rights, like right to a jury trial and all these sorts of things, no special taxes because you're Jewish. We give you all these individual rights, but you cannot act as a community.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, it's like this Shabbat kosher business, don't bother me. But yeah, you will have the right to appear before, people can't just pick you up and beat you up. You can come to court, you can sue people, you can own property, all that's fine. But no cultural collective right. And essentially what that does over time is you're going to be forced to meld into the majority. And essentially your culture will get destroyed. And that's what he wanted. He was a secular person. He didn't really care that there was that Jews became Christians, but he wanted Jews to be French at least. Atheistic French, sure. Maybe that's fine, but forget the particularity of Judaism. So when you have that sort of history, if you ask me, is it a persecution complex? It's like, well, can you tell me one place where Jews had an option where they could live on their own? And which is why I reject the persecution thing. That is the primary motivation. But yes, of course, there's no denying that when the idea of Zionism kicks in the late 1800s at least, persecution was definitely one of the key factors motivating migration. But it's again complicated there also. For example, when you see Jewish migration to Israel or to other parts of the world, one thing you will notice is that Israel for many is not the first choice. So it's not this sudden sense of like, oh yes, this is our land, our forefathers came from here, we have to go there. As late as 1990, for example, when the Russians allowed Jews to leave, the preferred destination was the United States, not Israel. Many of the people who came to Israel in the 1910s, 1920s and all, they went back to Europe saying, I can't live here, or I don't want this. Many of them came here because, for example, a Jew in Poland was perhaps found it difficult to go to France, and so he said, "Fine, if I can't go anywhere else, it's safer to be in Israel than staying in Poland. But ideally, I'd rather go to France or England." So it is persecution, but for whatever reason, that's not as high up as one might think on the sorry priorities for migration.
All right, then. Okay, so we've kind of covered the vague origins, and we've understood the reasons also in some way. But then, what is if we were to call the core of Zionism? So, what is the core of Zionism then? So, we have to still address that.
If you look at the activists of the late 1800s and the early 1900s, for them, they said that Zionism meant you have to believe that we should have a Jewish homeland. And I'll get back to that word homeland later. And that all the Jews should move to that homeland. Now, this creates problems for Jews who don't feel that persecuted. They said, why should I abandon my good life in Chicago or New York and go to this, desert hell? Because no, I mean, see, we think of Israel as or this area now as plagued by warfare and terrorism, but back in the day, this was like swampland and there's malaria. The swamps had to be like cleaned up and fixed and turned into agricultural land. It's very difficult. The first Aliyah, which was in 1882, struggled to live here. Many Jews went back, even in the second Aliyah. The figures as high as 50, 60, 70% of the people who came, they went back saying, I can't live here in Israel. So you tell an American Jews living comfortably in New York, in a city, in the US, and
Mhm.
you tell them suddenly that, if you're a Zionist, that means you have to go to Israel. They're like, yeah, no thanks, we're not interested. Right? So there is that thing. So over time, they realized that perhaps, Ben Gurion, for example, one of the first prime minister of Israel and one of the major leaders, he realized that Jews who live in America can still help Israel in terms of financial assistance, in terms of influence with the American government, and these all sorts of other things. And he
Yeah.
said, "Fine, we're going to keep quiet on the making aliyah. Just that's what they call immigration, right? Because
Mm.
for them, it's like it's special. It's not just immigration. Normal people immigrate, but this is holy. This is the divine sort of. God promises this land. This is our home. So it's not immigration. When a Jew goes to Israel, it's aliyah. Aliyah means to
Mm.
rise, right? To walk up, to rise up, towards Jerusalem. So
Got it.
he said, okay, fine. Let's back off on the whole. Every Jew has to make an aliyah sort of attitude, and this is again to this day it's contested. Many people still feel that Jews should make aliyah, and the diaspora is a problem. These debates keep continuing. Like, this is not settled, but I'm just telling you like the rough trajectory, the mainstream trajectory. And when I say mainstream, sometimes it might be by as little a margin as 51%. So don't think that this is like, okay, 90% of the people believe this and only 10% disagree with Jaideep. No. Some of these
Mm.
issues, like a 51-49, some of them are 80-20. So it depends. And he said the crux of this has to be that you have to believe in a Jewish state. Now, why
Mm.
is this important? Like I said, things like kosher. You live in the US, it's not easy to keep kosher because you have to check every restaurant. They're not compelled to keep kosher. They'll go by the majority population. They're not going to serve a minority. It's difficult to maintain kosher. Shabbat being holiday, for example. This is another problem. Like I have to go home for Shabbat, meaning Friday evening I have to go home and do my prayers or whatever it is. Other cultures will say, like, sorry, like Muslim countries will say Friday is a day of prayer, Saturday is your problem, not mine. And Christians will say Sunday is our day of prayer, our day of rest, Saturday is your problem, not mine. So these sorts of things are are an issue. These are just like two simple examples I gave, but it is not easy to for Jews to live in a society that does not accommodate them. And so that is why they said if we had our own country, we can designate Saturday as the weekly day off. So we can keep Shabbat, and we can have a law saying all restaurants should be kosher, or they should have like clear signs like about what is kosher, what is not. Supermarkets can be kosher, all these sorts of things. So it just becomes easier to live rather than be the exception where we have to struggle and figure out which restaurant is kosher, which supermarket is kosher. We can just be, and the exception will be the other way around.
Fair enough. Now let's get into a slightly different territory. So we covered the core, kind of covered the core, we covered the origins, and we covered the purpose also, in a way, why they thought of these things. Now, there's not one Zionism from what I have understood. So everybody's Zionism is something else. It's like the spectrum, right? So it's like the United Colors of Benetton or something. So that's how everybody has their own Zionism. So tell me now, what are the different kinds of Zionism? I guess we cannot cover all of them, but at least the ones that are in the mainstream and the ones that are probably kind of known the most.
See, when they say Zionism, and when I say most people, I mean most people who don't have a clue about Zionism, or don't really follow Israel too closely, or Jewish issues too closely. When they say Zionism, they think of Theodor Herzl and political Zionism, and that kind of Zionism is largely, I would say, secular. And again, I should explain that word. I will get to it. But essentially, it means that Judaism as a culture rather than as a religion, meaning you're not mandated to go for prayer every Saturday. It's not a law that you have to go for prayer. It's not a law that you have to keep kosher. It's not a theocracy. It is a lot more about the general symbols of the state, right? Like the menorah, the Star of David, Shabbat being the holiday instead of Saturday or instead of Sunday or a Friday or something. These sorts of things. But you're free to do what you want. You can be an atheist and live that culture, as many Jews do. They're very atheistic, but they're culturally Jewish, meaning they might be atheists, but they still follow kosher laws, for example. Right? These sorts of things. Now, that's the political sort of Zionism. Now, as I said, Zionism, the essence of it is you believe in a Jewish homeland. And this is, again, the thing. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 promised a Jewish homeland. It doesn't, technically speaking, if you want to think like a lawyer, it doesn't promise a Jewish state. Now, again, as I say, I'm going to say this a lot of times today. It can be debated that where Jewish leaders thinking of a state as early as 1917. I think yes. Some people think no. Some people think the decision to go for a Jewish state only came around about 1942. I don't think so. I think it came earlier. But regardless, the point is they wanted a homeland. Now the question for many of them was, one is how do you get there? And the second is how should it look? For example, now there's this one guy called Borokov. Now what he said is Israel has to be socialist. Why? Because from a Jewish perspective, he was a socialist, so he didn't really believe in the religious thing necessarily, but from the cultural Jewish perspective, not a religious decree. He said that I believe in socialism, and socialism means one of the things is about how do you control the means of production. And what happens in non-Jewish countries is that the Jews are always kept out. They're not allowed to control the means of production, right? Everybody else can, but Jews are treated as different. They're victims. They're not allowed to participate in the national sphere. Therefore, we need a Jewish country which should be run along socialist lines, and that is how he in a way married socialism with Zionism, nationalism. Now, it actually makes perfect sense when you think of it that way. Although normally we think of socialism as internationalist and nationalism as particularist. In his case, because Jews were targeted and kept away, he says, well, in this case, these two actually fit. Because we're not allowed to be part of the international sort of socialist movement. We'll have our own socialist movement, and if that makes it a national socialist movement, so be it, right? So that's one sort of thing. Now, labor Zionism, it's not as left-wing as perhaps Borokov would have wanted. Labor Zionism is basically like a social democracy type of thing, which Israel was until the mid-70s. And so that's, again, this is after you have the state, how do you run it? Now, another form of Zionism I can talk about is the revisionist Zionism, which is, again, a very popular thing. It's considered sort of like right-wing or whatever you want to call it. It's a little more complex, but for now, let's just keep it simple. Let's not, like I said, otherwise we'll be here for a whole year. Revisionist Zionism, for them, they were a little more militant. They had a sense of urgency in terms of getting Jews out of Europe into then Palestine, the British mandatory territory of Palestine. And they were not scared of using violence necessarily. Now, there are several reasons for this. One is they sort of, like Jabotinsky, for example, he had this fondness for the British, but he also saw them as obstacles. It's an odd balance. Now, the reason for this is that they realized that the British were preventing Jewish immigration into Palestine, so they were against it. At the same time, they realized that without British protection in the mandate, the Arabs would have a free hand to come and just massacre the Jewish population there. So they needed the British goodwill as well. So they have this like delicate dance they're doing there. So he wanted the British to train Jews. He tried to petition this even as far back as World War I, so that they can take care of themselves. Because ultimately he realized that only force will keep Jews safe. Because Jews were attacked by Arabs back in the day. It's not a phenomenon from the 1930s or 40s. It started like way back in the early 1900s or maybe even earlier. I would not say that was those attacks were necessarily nationalist inspired. They might have been simply like burglars, robbers, because if you see a rich Jewish house, attack it. It might have been as simple as that. The national element comes in later, but regardless, Jews needed protection, and if the British were not keen on protecting or didn't really care about it, somebody had to do it. And so that is the revisionist sort of more militant sort of Zionism. You'll see that groups that splintered from this. We'll talk about the Lehi, for example. In English, you call it the Stern Gang, or the Etzel, or in English, you call it Irgun. Now, they were more militant, and in fact, there's another group which lasted only for 3 years between 1930 and 1933, led by Abba Ahimer, for example, called the Habirionim. And they were closer to what one might call terrorists. Now, again, terrorism is a loaded political word, depends on several things in terms of who are you targeting and all these sorts of things. But regardless, these were far more militant, whereas the idea of labor Zionists like Ben Gurion was by and large to cooperate. Again, this is not so simple because in 1939, when the British White Paper comes, and people ask Ben Gurion, what do you want to do? The British are prohibiting immigration into Palestine, even though now there is clear evidence that Hitler is persecuting them. So he said, he said, I'm going to fight the Germans with the British as if there is no white paper, and I'm going to fight the British against the white paper to try and get more immigration into Palestine as if there are no Germans. I have to fight them both, but I have to play this game. At the end of the day, it's better for me that England wins than Germany wins. So there's a lot of balancing there, even among these sorts of things. Another form of Zionism, if you want to call it that, you can call it diaspora Zionism, which is Jews in America, for example. Louis Brandeis is one of the great examples of this, where he said, look, I don't have to come to Israel. I can believe in a Jewish homeland, a Jewish nation state also, without actually moving there myself. And so the joke about American Zionism and diaspora Zionism, if you want to call it that, is exactly this. What is American Zionism? They say it's when one Jew pays another Jew so that a third Jew can move to Israel. So the American guy... So the American guy will give money to the Yishuv, the movement in Israel or then Palestine, so that they can support the movement of Jews from, say, like Poland or Russia or somewhere to come and live in Israel or Palestine, as I said. Because this costs money. They come here and immigration was controlled. There were quotas, and you have to prove that you can support yourself. And so the Americans said, hey, look, we don't want to go there because we don't feel as persecuted. And this is a debate between Israel and the diaspora to this day, relations. Because remember, one of the things many people say is, yeah, sure, we felt safe in Germany until 1933, and we felt safe in France. And then suddenly what happened? The pogroms started. The only place a Jew can be safe, and this is with 2,000 years of experience, we can say, the only place we can be safe is in our own country. This is what Israelis will say. Many Israelis would say, at least.
Yeah. So just one question I think about when it comes to American Jews and Zionism in general in America, or I don't even know if it should be called Zionism or not. I think there's always this dual loyalty accusation on American Jews, right? It's a serious issue. I remember even like a conservative, like a proper conservative Jewish commentator like Ben Shapiro always has to clarify. And I see, Ben Shapiro overdoing at times the whole I love America spiel all the time. And it's a major issue. So I just wanted to take an offshoot from that. So how are the relationship, what is the relationship between let's say Zionists in Israel and the Jews, let's say outside Israel? So how are their relationships? Are they cordial, or has the left infiltrated in a major way in that relationship too?
See, the thing is, if you live in Israel, it's difficult not to be a Zionist. Now, you might be a little more on the left, meaning that you might, and you'll notice that in Israel, the left and the right, by and large, I'm not talking about the far left or the far right, but by and large, they seem to agree on like a basic core sort of agenda when it comes to, say, the Arab question, the Palestinian question. And this is one of the reasons why in Israel, there were like 2 or 3 elections, and the Arabs basically said, what difference does it make whether left or right wins? It's not going to affect us much. The Palestinian question will not be resolved. So there is, so most Israelis, again, like I said, there are Israelis who are not Zionists, and that's another. We can get to that also. I'm having so many caveats today. Like every time I keep saying, let's get to that, let's get to that. But this should show you how complex this is, and you cannot have like paint the whole. Even just like a small country like Israel with one paintbrush, it's just very difficult. With one brush, it's hard. There are some people, but the question is a scope, in the sense, if you are going to have Palestine as a separate state, what are the boundaries? That's where the disputes are. But the idea that a Jewish state should exist, if you're living in Israel, and if you, unless you're like a right wing, not right wing, sorry, let's call it a religious, for a radical extremist, whatever you want to call it, you are a Zionist usually, because you believe in the Jewish state. Now, there are very few people. There are some Jews, radical, very religious Jews, who don't believe that Israel should exist, because they feel that Israel should be created by the Messiah. Now, there is a kind of Zionism called religious Zionism. So that's different. There are religious people who say, look, yes, Israel should be is the promised land, and we should wait for the Messiah. But how do we know what God's plans are? In the sense, maybe sending us leaders in that period, in the 1890s and the early 1900s, maybe that was God's way of establishing Israel. So it's not like somebody comes in with an ID card saying, hey, listen, I'm your Messiah, I will create Israel for you. So how do you know? So there are religious people who believe that Israel should exist, but then there are some very hardcore sort of Jewish people who don't, like Neturei Karta is one group, for example, who don't believe Israel should exist. So, but that's like a fringe of a fringe. So it's not many, but in Israel, you're generally a Zionist. With America, what happens is the dual loyalty. Now, see, this is again why Israelis will say, and again, I generalize when I say this, but still, let me put it this way. The criticism of the diaspora is this, that you are never seen as part of that host country, no matter how comfortable you are. And there's no doubt that Jews in America have done well for themselves in medicine, in law, in entertainment, in all kinds of professions, right? And yet, this whole question of dual loyalty. Now, the simple question is, do you see the same question being asked of, say, a Protestant German who came only 20 years ago or 30 years ago to the US, of dual loyalty? No, nobody says, maybe you are a German spy. Nobody says that.
Yeah,
So
that's
only
so
with the
true.
Jew, right? And okay, and here's the thing, forget white and Christian, like even like you take somebody like say from India or something. I'm not aware of anybody saying, to the Indians who have now become Americans, to that crowd, maybe you are really an Indian spy. No, that's so the race, the religion, all these things, they matter only when the Jewish question comes up. And this is
Yeah,
exactly what many people will say. See, America might treat you very well, but remember, the fact that we're even talking about a dual identity, this dual loyalty thing, shows that you're not really one of them. No matter how many years you have lived there, no matter that you were born, your grandparents were born, brought up there, no matter that you have served in the military and served in the legal services and the foreign ministry, you've really given everything, your life, to this country. I do think, honestly speaking, having lived in the US for very long, I do think that American Jews really genuinely believe they're Americans. They also are Jewish, but they are genuinely American. I don't think this is an act or something. It's just that when you keep getting asked, the topic comes up. So that is there. So the relations, what happens is when you live in New York or Chicago or wherever else, California, whatever, your priorities change, your nature, the way you look at the world changes. When you live in Israel, it's different. um, the question for Jews in America, for example, the security is not as much of a problem as it is in Israel. So these different priorities, these create different worldviews, and that's where there are definitely disputes between the two. But here's one thing I will tell you: it is interesting to note that regardless how much they disagree with each other, American Jews still feel an obligation to have a position on Israel. Like if you're an American Jew, and again, not everybody, of course, there are many ill-informed people, that's like normal, but there's still the sense that I should know something about Israel. and that remains a referent in their lives. So in that sense, like even if they disagree, they're still attached to this, to the idea of Israel, if not the state of Israel itself.
I get it. I kind of understand the conundrum. Also, I get reminded of who was that, Ignatieff, right? Who wrote that book, How the Jews Became White Folks, and he actually talks about a lot of problems the Jews faced when they in the early years in America, and it was I mean, constant anti-Semitism. And if you ask me, I'm not saying it's exactly anti-Semitic all the time, but a lot of times, especially in the far left circles, when Jews are asked these questions about dual loyalty, no, it's not in the far right. This question is always asked from the far left nowadays about dual loyalty to American Jews. And you know what I found very interesting? Here, the left wing, especially the far left, I thought nationalism meant nothing for them, right? It was a fiction, it meant nothing. But on the Jews, it's very interesting. It's always the question is raised, where does your loyalty lie? Where are you loyal to? I was like, hello, you can't be, hypocritical. I thought you guys did not believe in nationalism. You guys are far left wingers, right? Then why are you questioning whether somebody else is loyal to America or not? Whether they are or not should not even matter to you, right? It's a philosophical no-go zone for you.
Yeah, and the thing is, one more thing I want to point out is like how the Jews became white, for example. This sort of question. See, one thing Hitler does do is he makes it difficult to be openly anti-Semitic like in the past. Because you look at like intellectuals, like very famous physicists or historians, whatever. In the 1930s, it was very easy to say, Jews, they're inferior. It's not a big deal. That's just like normal. After World War II, it becomes a lot more difficult to say that. There's this stigma, you have to appear in a certain way. So what happens is it shifts. The argument becomes about class all of a sudden, right? And they say, well, it's because they're not educated properly. They don't, speak English as well. They speak with a thick German accent, or they wear weird clothes they used to wear in Poland 50 years ago. They don't fit in that, cosmopolitan sort of environment. And of course, when it comes to Israel itself, there's double standards. I mean, the UN, for example, Human Rights Commission, it's really good with countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, all these sorts of, Somalia, all these sorts of countries. And guess what? Israel has like 600 resolutions against them and like one or something against Iran or something, for example, right? And so there's Alan Dershowitz, he writes that, he says, it is anti-Semitism, but because it's cleverly disguised in these arguments of like international law and class and these sorts of other things, so you can't they don't come out right and say, I hate you because you're Jewish. He says, fine, I'm just going to call it a different name. It's a Judeopathy, he calls it. And he says it's essentially the same thing. It's, you just, now you realize you can't call me a Jew and hate me. So now you're going to say, oh, but Israel does this. And, it doesn't matter, everybody else does this, but Israel should not do this.
Yeah, I get it. So let's cover this aspect now. So what do you think is the state of Zionism in current day Israel? And when I say current day Israel, obviously I mean the Israeli society today. And how are they dealing with? Because see, if you honestly ask me, it's not that it was not there in the past, but especially now in the post-social media world, a lot of voices get amplified, especially fringe voices. So even when there is a far left critique of Zionism, and maybe the mainstream center left may not be as anti-Semitic. I'm not saying the center left is not anti-Semitic. I think there are a lot of anti-Semitism in the center left too. And obviously in the right wing too, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in the right wing too. But that is like, the anti-Semitism of the right wing is out and out Jew hatred. That's all they do. They're like, you're Jews. They have that Jesus problem with them, and they say we hate you. So it's like that, right? There it is very clear. But the left wing anti-Semitism is very close. So what is the status of Zionism in today in terms of modern Israel, which is a democracy, whether people like it or not? It is a democracy.
It is. Before I answer that question, remind me if I forget the question, but let me just, you said the Jesus question, the Jesus problem, the Jesus issue, you said something like that. And I think it's very true. Like, I tried to understand anti-Semitism for the longest time. It just made no sense to me. It's like, why would you just randomly pick up people and say, I hate you? Like, it's not like these people, have been a nuisance, or wherever you see Jewish existence. I'm particularly familiar with Jews in Germany and Spain, but in other places also, they have contributed a lot to the local culture and local economy. And so why would you hate these guys? It never made sense to me until one day one professor said very clearly to me, he says, if you don't understand it as basically that they are held to be responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, then you will not understand. I said that makes no sense. I mean, whether Jesus existed or not is one debate some people have. But even if the Bible is 100% true, like it happened 2,000 years ago, how can you possibly? But there is that line: His blood be on us and our children forever. Right? There is that anti-Semitic line. And if you look at early Christians, I mean, I'm going back as far back as like Ambrose and all these people, like way back, early 400s.
Yeah.
You see anti-Semitism even there. It's not like you don't have to wait until the Middle Ages, the Crusades, for example. The Crusades, they say, okay, yeah, the Christians in 1094, the first Crusades, they go to quote unquote liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims, right? But guess what they do? As they march through Europe, they keep killing Jews because they want to purify Europe for Christianity and
Yeah.
take. So you don't have to wait till 1000. Ambrose is very anti-Semitic, even as late as what do you call it? As far back as the late 300s and the early 400s. You'll see that. So then, I'm just started working on anti-Semitism, or at least anti-Jewishness, at least before Christianity. It's an interesting thing. I've just started like literally like a few days ago. So I will expand my knowledge on that. Now back to your question, which is completely different. You asked me what is the status of Zionism in Israel today. The thing is, there is one group of people who think that the purpose of Zionism has been achieved. The purpose of Zionism was what? To create a Jewish state. Well, there is a Jewish state now, and whether you like it or not, it's not going anywhere. It's a powerful state. It's a regional power, and it is not going to be wiped out anytime soon. So they feel, okay, we're done with Zionism. Now let's move on. So there is that group, definitely. But the majority of the Israeli public is center right. And they feel that the process is not over. And honestly, I think this is a better understanding of Zionism, because if you read Ben Gurion's diaries, which I actually did a couple of months ago, he sees Zionism as a process. He says, first of all, it's not about just creating the state. It's also about creating a state and then making sure it lives up to our Jewish heritage ideals. And so it's a continuous process. And he says, we want Israeli democracy to be a participatory democracy. The government and the people, there should not be a hierarchy. It should be like a flat thing, and that they have really achieved in Israel. You see, I mean, how many places do you call the prime minister by the nickname Bibi, for example, Netanyahu, right?
Yeah.
So in Israel, the hierarchy it might not be perfectly flat, but it's pretty much almost perfectly flat. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it is participatory. It is possible for the a mechanic, as Yaakov Katz, editor of Jerusalem Post, he writes in his book about Israeli startups and all these sorts of things. He says a mechanic working on an F-15 who understands the plane, and because he's a mechanic for the plane, he can very easily criticize, like, colonel or something. If he says, okay, this is what we have to do, he's like, "Arey, this will not work because the F-15 has these issues, these limitations, and it's perfectly okay." Nobody's going to say, "Arey, colonel se baat kar rahe ho aap, like, औकात में रहे, तू mechanic hai, what do you know?" This doesn't happen, right? So Ben Gurion wanted that sort of stuff. So if you look at that sort of approach of Zionism as a living, continuously evolving process, Zionism cannot be over. But as I said, I mean, if we stick to that basic definition and not add all fancy, additional properties, characteristics, like should it be socialist, or should it be achieved through force or through negotiation? If you forget that and just remember the core goal of a Jewish state, the homeland, I think that the Zionism, most Israelis you will find are Zionists, left and right. This is the one thing that, for all the differences the left and right have about Netanyahu or about what a Palestinian state should look like. Some people might say, we don't want a Palestinian state. We gave them Jordan in 1921. Let them go there. Some people will say, no, 67 boundaries are fair. Some people will say something close to 67 boundaries, maybe the 2000 agreement Ehud Barak had offered, something like that. These differences might be there, but not like pretty much very, very few people will ever be anti-Zionist in Israel.
All right, so I have two more questions of you, and then I'll take the live chat viewers' questions, because four people have already asked very good questions. So we have four questions to deal with. So one thing I had written down was that this whole one state, two state solution thing. So how much of it is also connected to Zionism? Obviously, when we say one state, two state, so explain to the people what is this whole one state, two state conundrum, and why is it so connected to Zionism too?
Okay. Now, the thing about one of the things you will notice about the Zionists, the Yeshuv, the Jews who lived in mandatory Palestine, is that they were very practical people, pragmatic people. Now they can insist and there are complications, like when you say God promised us this land, do you mean the kingdom of Judah? Do you mean that promise where he says from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates? Which part do you mean? So Israel, the Holy Land, is promised in different parts, and at different times there are different boundaries, and this is a debate. So the Jews said, okay, first, that's one issue. The second issue is this, that we have to be practical. If we keep asking for everything, we'll get nothing. So we are willing to compromise. So in 1921, 1917, what happens, the Balfour Declaration, they say we'll give a Jewish homeland in mandatory Palestine. In 1921, the British partition, about 75-77% of the mandate, they cut off and create the Emirate of Jordan, or Transjordan as it was called then. In 49 or something, it becomes Jordan. And so the Jews are like, okay, they said, fine, we get only 22-23% of the land, fine, we're okay with that. Let's compromise, let us get a country at least, so that, we're willing to deal with this. Then what happens is the Arabs are like not happy with this. It's like, no, you guys don't belong here, get out, all that sort of stuff. And the Arabs have the Arab Revolt of 1936. So the British, in their negotiations with the Arabs, they talked to them and they said, okay, this is clearly a problem, and these guys clearly can't live side by side. So let's partition this again. So that 22-23% that was left, that again should be partitioned. And this idea was floated officially in 1937, early 1937, in the Peel Commission. Now, you don't have to remember the names. Just the idea is that of partitioning again was created, and that is like into two states, which is Palestine and Israel, an Arab state and a Jewish state. Call it what you want. Now, for me, because of my own, my reading and my understanding of history and the politics of this time and everything, I still say, like, when I use a different terminology. I say, if you say, because I say, let us not forget that Jordan was already taken away, and you're having another state. So so the two-state solution for me, like, is already Jordan is there and there's no Palestine, right? That becomes a third state for all intents and purposes if you look at it historically. But since nobody uses this terminology, to keep things simple and not to confuse people who are not as familiar with the history, I'll stick to the mainstream terminology of saying two states, which is a Palestinian state today and Israel, a Jewish state. Now, what happens is, again, here we have Gaza on one side and the West Bank, or as Israelis would call it, Judea and Samaria, on the eastern side of the country. And as you know, Gaza is controlled by Hamas, and Fatah controls the West Bank. So again, we don't know if that's going to be one state or that's going to like fall apart and become two states like Pakistan, Bangladesh happened, because these things are not easy when they're separated and two different kinds of people are ruling these areas. But what has happened is, so the two state is like you create you find some sort of negotiation, you create Palestine, you create Israel. Israel is there, you create a Palestinian state, and you have a two-state solution. That's what that is. A one-state solution basically says, look, there's so many Jews now living in the West Bank that it is difficult to separate them from the West Bank. It'll create a whole bunch of hardships to uproot so many people. There's about 600,000 Jews in beyond the Green Line, as they call it, the terminology for it, right? 600,000. Most of them, half of them, are around Jerusalem, the suburbs, which has really expanded since 1948 when Israel was created. And then there are others, the settlements all across Judea and Samaria, primarily in Area C, but other places also. Now, they say to uproot them creates so much misery and it is difficult. And then there are questions of like, okay, if Israel allows for a Palestinian state, will it allow this potential Palestinian state to maintain an army, have independent foreign relations? Because see, if you create an Arab state today and they just turn around and go to Iran or to some other like Turkey, and they become a thorn in Israel's side, Israel will not want to allow that. So what they'll say is, look, you guys can have your own economy, you can have your own foreign relations, all that sort of stuff, but you're not allowed to have an army. A police force, yes, but not an army. Why? Because you start allowing, say, Iranian troops to be stationed in the West Bank. It's going to create a real problem for our security. So we can't allow you to do this. So, but these sorts of relations are the sovereign right of any normal country. So the argument comes, since Palestine cannot be a truly sovereign country, maybe there should be just one country, like this, combine the two. There is no Arab state, but it's like a Jewish slash Arab one state, like Israel Palestine hyphenated. The problem with this comes is that if you do that, as of today, I think the Arabs would have like 51 or 52% of the population. So then the only way a Jewish identity can be protected is through basically apartheid. There's no other way that a Jewish identity can be protected, because in elections, the majority will have that demographic advantage. And again, going back to the beginning of our podcast, as I said, the only reason these people had for a Jewish state was that they were not allowed to be Jewish anywhere else. So if you give that up today, again, for the sake of Israel slash Palestine, like one country, again, there is not a single state where you can be Jewish and safe. The whole point is to protect not just the safety, that's one thing, of course, but the second thing is also to protect their culture, their heritage. It's the only Jewish country in the world. How do you protect that culture and heritage? Like anywhere else, like see in America, for example, yes, maybe the anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe and America in the last few years. That's one thing. And yeah, maybe that there will be some religious Jews in America who will maintain their culture, whatever. But there's a huge danger of assimilation. Many American Jews have become more American and less Jewish. They don't know much about Judaism, and they sort of don't mind visiting a church with their friends, or actually not doing anything, just going to a bar and having like a bacon cheeseburger, whatever, these sorts of things, and they lose their heritage through assimilation. It's what in India you might call like what we would call like deracination or something, in a way, right? So they become less Jewish in that traditional sense. So Israel, by virtue of being a Jewish country from the state perspective, where you protect Shabbat, kosher, and Jewish ideas and values and institutions, it's the only way you can maintain the Jewish thing. That's why the one-state solution is just, in my opinion, is just absolute lunacy. I think it's basically suicide if anybody supports that sort of thing. And it's a backdoor. Basically, what is the Arab objection or the Muslim objection, or however, the Palestinian objection? They say that we don't want a Jewish state, right? And this is a backdoor to wiping out the Jewish state, because it can't be a Jewish state once it's a one country.
Yeah, I kind of get that logic. So one last question before I go into the audience once was, so tell me the relationship between Zionism and colonialism and imperialism. That was my last question for you.
That's a very good question, because this is a very standard accusation you hear leftists hurl at Israel. Usually, in my experience, very poorly informed people. They accuse Zionists, the Yishuv, of colonialism or imperialism, because they say the first thing is that the argument is they're not from here. They come here, they take this land, and they colonize it. My question is, let's just stick to the definition of colonialism. When the British came to India and colonized India, it was for the sake of extracting wealth from India and sending it to England. When the Jews came to Israel, where were they sending the wealth to? Just out of curiosity, right? That's one thing. The second thing, they say, oh no, but that's a different kind of colonialism, settler colonialism, where you are trying to take the land itself and cleanse the land of the native population. This is again assuming that the assumption here is again that the Jews don't belong to that land, which the Jews
Mm.
will vehemently deny, saying, "Look, we were kicked out by the Romans, and we were kept out by subsequent rulers. But our origins are there. It is very clear." So that is the Jewish claim. Um, but in sorry, what was I saying? The settler colonialism, the issue comes. These guys will say is that you want to get rid of the native population. And here again the problem comes when you look at settler colonialism, like say America, for example, right? That's one standard example of settler colonialism. The British went there, they took the land from the natives, and they created again for the service of England. Now it just so happens that because of various reasons, these settlers decided to create a country of their own. But again, it was in
Yeah.
service of the crown. And so again, my question comes: if these Jews come and say that if you want to look at them as colonials, where is the wealth extraction? What are they sending it back to? In service of whom? Because I can tell you one thing, that the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Poles, the Italians, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, none of these people thought the Jews were their own people. So there's no wealth extraction for their benefit at all.
Hmm. Yeah.
Right? The only reason you might use you will have to find a different word. You can't use colonialism there. That's my first point.
Fair
Okay.
enough.
Then comes you might want to challenge this argument, like, do the Jews belong here or not? Now one argument is like, surely there has to be some sort of statute of limitations. Otherwise, we can't keep going back forever, right? Jews were kicked out, but then things have changed. Now here, the importance of the land is very clear from a cultural perspective for the Jews, because when the British offered them, it's called the Uganda Plan in 1903, 1904. And the Uganda Plan was actually about giving a part of Kenya. Okay, the names, it's called Uganda Plan. No, that's British geography, imperial geography for you. Um, and creating a Jewish state. Now, what happens? The Jews said, no, 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 we don't want this. Like, there were some what we call territorialists who said, "ठीक है, it doesn't matter. Let's get a country and be done with it." And then some people tried to like create a middle ground by saying, first we'll take this country, then we'll give it up and go to Palestine later. But most of the people saw this as not something that's feasible, and they said, "No, our land was promised to us by God. Our forefathers lived there, and this is our land, and we can't accept anything else." So that shows a Jewish commitment, like of a homeland. Even when they offered something else, they said, "No, we can't accept that." So it's not like they just wanted any land. Now, a colonial power will, like, if the British want to make inroads into India, they don't really care whether you capture Bombay or Calcutta. As long as it's profitable, they'll take whatever that comes. These guys were very specific. They could have taken Kenya. It's fertile land. It's better than the desert, definitely. But they said, "No, this is important to us." And so they went for that specific land. That shows again that the Jewish connection to that land. Now, if you're an Indian and you get American citizenship, but or whatever European citizenship, and you live outside, but let's say you maintain your religion, right? Now, you might feel, yes, today I live in Denmark and I'm Danish, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, when it comes to Hinduism, you're not going to look at the Rhine and the Seine River outside, across the border. You're going to think about Ganga, and that will evoke that sentimentality in you. And that's what is important. We have to keep that also in mind.
Fair enough. I agree with you. I think that sums up it pretty well. Now let's go into audience questions who are watching it live. By the way, I'm really impressed. Some really good questions. So I think the first two by Anam and Ramakrishnan can be clubbed together. So Anam was like, why do certain groups of Christians and Muslims become so paranoid about Jews? And Ramakrishnan has added a very specific question. Christopher Hitchens alluded to Jew hatred being intrinsic to Christianity due to the accusations of deicide. What is the view of Jews about Christians in this regard? So I think we can club both these questions together because they're kind of interconnected. So
This
bole.
goes to what you had briefly mentioned about the Jesus issue, right? Why is Christianity fundamentally anti-Semitic? It's because basically Christians see it as Jews killed their God.
Yeah.
Uh, it's as simple as that. And this is, I mean, Christopher Hitchens, sure, but this accusation has been made for hundreds of years. It's nothing new. And in fact, again, going back to Alan Dershowitz, who's written well on this, I forget what book it is. I think it's Chutzpah. It's called Chutzpah. It's in the late 90s. He wrote a book where he says, look, this easily, and he says, look, I'm not a scholar on this, but even I can very easily trace this straight up to Martin Luther, who's one of the Protestant thing, right? He says, and we can go further back, but the purpose of his book is not about anti-Semitism specifically; it's about American Jews. So he says, I'm not going to get into it, but just to give you a quick example, and he gives Martin Luther as an example. He says anti-Semitism is inherent in that.
Yeah.
So now, what is the Jewish view of Christianity? I mean, let's face it, Jews never had the power, and to this day, they don't have the power of taking on Christianity that way. Look, where is 14 million Jews versus like what 1.5 billion Christians? So if you're looking at it from a very sort of materialist, sort of like a conflict kind of scenario, that's not feasible. That said, to be fair to Christians, there is a certain group of Christians who now really like Israel for their own benefit, of course, which is that they think that when all the Jews go back to Israel, the Messiah will come. That is a sign of the end times, and for that religious reason,
evangelical Christians, actually hardcore evangelical.
Right. So there is that also. I mean, I am honestly surprised, and maybe it might just be because it is not feasible, but I am honestly surprised by the lack of any sort of hostility or ill will among Jews for Christians or Muslims, which is like unbelievable. They might have issues with like specific countries, like they'll say like, okay, the Labour Party in England is anti-Semitic. Okay, but they're not going to say all Anglicans are anti-Semitic. They don't have that. And honestly, I do find them, the Jews, a lot more tolerant than I am about some of these issues. I'll tell you that much. Yeah. I struggle. I ask them, how is it that you have moved on? I don't understand that, but they have.
Yeah, they're quite open-minded and tolerant people. So this actually question is very interesting. This one was asked by Karan. Karan asks, could it be argued that the Jewish persecution that we discussed earlier on is also about Jews being inflexible? Don't the Muslims also argue that they are persecuted because they aren't allowed to practice their religion fully in foreign countries? Interesting question.
I see, actually, it sounds like an interesting question, but the answer is actually, for once, the first time in this podcast, is actually quite simple. The fundamental difference is that with Jews, they will do their thing and they leave you out of it. They're not going to come and convert you. They're not going to come and tell you, you have to do things this way. You can sit right next to a Jew and have your bacon and he'll just not touch it. But, and they will not try to have like, Jews will not say, okay, we need a Jewish holiday. They'll not come and say Yom Kippur needs to be a holiday in India. No, they'll do their thing. They will have their holidays. They will do their thing and mind their own business. With Islam and Christianity, they are universalist religions, which means for them, they think the whole world can be Christian, the whole world can be Muslim. Jews are particular. They don't convert. And that is one of the biggest reasons why Jews can get along quite easily in most places if the host culture is willing to accept them. Now, in a country like India, Hindus, if you don't bother us, nobody cares what you do. And that's why they live for like, I don't know, depends on which group of Jews, but some group, you'll say easily 2,000 years at least. And there's been no problem. The only anti-Semitism I found in India are by European Christians who came to India during the era of imperialism, or by Indian Muslim rulers, and the Jews ran away and took protection under Hindu kings in that locality, in that region at that time. But absolutely, the Hindu has not had a problem because they don't, they say, you mind your business, I mind my business. And Jews are pretty good with that. And so that's why I would say that when Jews say we want to practice our religion, that's fine. Why? Because they're not asking you to convert. They're not asking you to make any special accommodation for them. They just want to be left alone to do their thing, which is usually not the case with the Muslim populations. It's always the next step.
Yeah, and something I need to...
They want that minaret.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
they want that minaret, and then they want that loudspeaker. Just always this theocratic creep, as I call it.
Yeah, so I'll tell you something very interesting. With the Jews, it's the complete opposite. In fact, it's very hard to become a Jew. It's like they make it even harder for you to enter that sect, as if it's like this elite, Bandra ka club where 1 crore ka membership hai, you can't enter. Are you good
Right.
enough to enter? It's
One
like
of
the
my
complete
friends,
opposite.
one of my friends in the US, he converted. He married a Jewish woman, and he's a PhD student. One of my friends, and he said he wanted to convert. It took him 7 years. It's not like you come and you recite some prayer and you're done. They're like, the guy first time he goes, they're like, yeah, no thanks, we're not interested. And the guy's like, not interested, I don't understand, like, what do you mean? It's like, no, we don't want you to convert, it's okay, thank you. And he's like, hey, what the hell? So he went back like the second or third time he had to go. The third time or something, finally he's like, okay, you want to convert? Yeah. Like, why? He's like, well, my wife's Jewish. Like, so what? You are converting, your wife's Jewish already, she's fine. Why do you want to convert? Then he's like, oh, no, because I am religious and I think this makes sense. Really? What have you read? The guy's like, no, I've heard. It's like, heard, no, you have to go read it. So the guy goes, reads the Bible, comes back, and then the guy's like, okay, which Bible did you read? He goes, no, but this is English. You don't know Hebrew, so you don't know the translation is good or not. You have to learn Hebrew. The guy, 7 saal lagaye. And I mean, he wasn't in any rush. He took his time and he was genuine, but it's not easy. They don't want converts.
Yeah, I get it, and this is actually very true. Like most people don't realize. So Sasidharan Karthikeyan has a very specific question. So he says, "Can you ask Jaideep why Abraham Stern wanted to make a pact with Hitler? Was it only his skepticism towards the British, or it was more than that?"
Yeah, okay. The first thing is, I think some of these people were opportunistic, because the thing is, the question is, how do you look at the situation? He's referring to Lehi, um, where uh, a certain group of Jews during World War II decided that they're going to side with, not side with, that's too strong a word, but take help from Hitler to fight the British. Now, what is the context of this? I very briefly explain. I'm happy that this gives me an opportunity to explain again. The British in 1936, when the Arab revolts happened, they stopped immigration basically or they limited drastically. They said 75,000 people over 5 years, right?
Hmm.
And after that, permission from the Arabs if more have to come. And they said
Okay.
they used the term called economic capacity. The problem with economic capacity was that the Jewish areas were more capable and the Muslim areas were less capable. But when you take the average, the capacity goes down, which means less immigration can occur. So the Jews
Hmm.
were like, look, if we can take care of these people, why does it matter that our neighbor is poor? We can take care. So
True.
there, and the British are basically, to be honest, the British were just playing their game. They wanted to protect their oil. There's a pipeline from Iraq to Haifa, the Baghdad, whatever, Mosul Haifa pipeline. They wanted to protect the oil supplies. It was straight up realpolitik for them. Although there is an argument to be made that regardless of British foreign policy or mandatory policy, there was some anti-Semitism among on the ground among British officers serving in the mandate. Not all, but many. So this is and what happens is, for example, the riots, many Jews get killed, and this is when the Jews are warning the British, look, this is going to be a problem, you have to protect us. And the British say, hey, don't worry about it. And then the riots occur and many Jews get killed. And so basically many Jews say, look, the British are being particularly careless about our interests, our safety, these sorts of things. The white paper keeps promising the Arabs, like, no, 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 don't worry, we'll not create a Jewish state. And then they'll come to us and say, no, we will create a Jewish state. So they're playing this double game. So they don't trust the British, which I don't blame them. But this is how that goes. Now, from the perspective of Palestine, in that narrow sort of in this context, if somebody says, let's see, like when Bose went and said, look, I want to get help from the fascists, right? It's not because he was a Nazi. Subhash Chandra Bose, he might have been an authoritarian, but that there's a difference between authoritarianism and fascism, or there's a difference between authoritarianism and Nazism, regardless. He was not that. In fact, he thought Hitler was a crazy man. You can see in his notes about him. Bada Pagal, he used to call Hitler. Nonetheless, he said, look, I have to fight the British, and these are the only people who are capable of fighting the British. because Indians at that point were not strong enough. So he said, fine, train the British, train Indian soldiers to fight the British and other sorts of assistance. And the same sort of thinking goes with Abraham Stern. He wanted that because in the mandate, this is a problem. Now, what happens is the other side, to give you the fuller picture, is someone like Ben Gurion will say, look, we agree that the British are a nuisance, they are a problem. And to be fair, in 45, Lehi and Etzel and Haganah, which is the main Jewish movement in the issue, in the mandate, they unite for about a year or something against the British. So it's not like these guys love the British, but Ben Gurion said, look, if we attack the British and the British say, you know what, I'm sick and tired of you guys whining all the time, I'm going to side with the Arabs, we are screwed. Because
Yeah.
the Jewish population in Palestine needed protection from the British until they were able to take care of themselves. And that ability to take care of themselves was thrust upon them. They were not completely ready, but it was thrust upon them in 47 with the partition vote in the UN in November 1947. Until then, these guys were they're building up from 45 to 47. Ben Gurion had he worked super hard, extra hard to make sure that the Jews would be ready to protect themselves from the inevitable war that would come. He predicted this would happen. But until then, so someone like Ben Gurion will tell Abraham Stern, Bhai, I get your anger against the British that they are not allowing immigration despite Hitler killing the Jews. Even then, they're not allowing them to come. They're not letting Jews come to England despite the genocide on the mainland. I get your anger completely. But if we go against the British, yeah, then the Germans are definitely against us. The British are also against us. We can't fight everybody. That
Yeah.
practicality. And this practicality is unparalleled. I have never seen such a practical political movement in my life. I've studied quite a few of them. This level of practicality that the Yishuv leaders had is unbelievable.
Yep. So it's good that you brought in an Indian example, because the last two questions are about India and Israel. So I'm going to change the order. So I'm going to ask Aurindrajit's question first, because I think Harsh's question should be the last one where we end the discussion, because it's an important question. So Aurindrajit asks, can you comment on why India antagonized Israel after independence?
Yeah, actually, I can tell you why they antagonized them even before independence. There's actually a wonderful book I had reviewed also, India's Israel Policy by this guy, Nicholas Blarell. If you don't have the patience, you can read my review. But to summarize that review also, if you don't have the patience for that also, is that is that first of all, Gandhi's understanding of the Jewish situation came from his Christian friends, and that is you're already starting on the wrong foot there.
Yeah, that's a very important point.
And this is something people don't understand. People say, "Oh, is Gandhi anti-Semitic?" Some people ask, "No, he wasn't anti-Semitic. He just didn't understand it, and he
Yeah.
realized that he finally realized like in 45, 46, hey, maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe my assumptions are wrong here." And at that point, like he'd already said so much nonsense, and there were many Jews in America as well as in mandatory Palestine who wrote harshly about Gandhi, because Gandhi also wrote harshly about Jews, very impractical solutions like, you must fall at Hitler's feet and these sorts of things.
Yeah. What the hell?
Yeah. But it shows, honestly, it shows Gandhi's, first of all, it shows his ignorance about the Jewish situation.
So true.
And this is something that the Yeshuv sent Jews to try and educate him and to make him realize what the situation was. The second thing is, again, you might have a certain political philosophy and it may or may not work in your country, but does not mean it has to work everywhere. This idea that satyagraha has to work everywhere, that's not possible. Particular characteristics of every freedom movement, of every revolution. So this has to be considered also, which Gandhi clearly didn't. So that's before the independence. After independence, there's always this fear, and I've never understood why, but there's always this fear that the Muslims will feel bad. And I've asked people, I said, are you saying that if you say that the Muslims will feel bad, what you're really saying is Muslims are traitors, because they are not willing to go with the national interest. Their sentiment is above the national interest. So anybody who says the Muslims will feel bad and that's why we have to side with the Palestinians instead of the Israelis, they're implying indirectly that Muslims are traitors, that they can't look at the Indian national interest, that their own community interests are above the Indian national interest. So This is the easiest reason. And India treated Israel really badly. The real question is like, why did Israel put up with it? Initially, I would say it's because, like the Israeli economy, Israel is a new country, like aid from anywhere would help if aid was possible at all, that sort of stuff. Diplomatic assistance, all these things. Today, Israel is in a very different position, of course, but in the 50s and 60s, it was not so rosy in Israel. There was, for example, there's one case, an Israeli president, I think, was flying from Israel to Nepal, and he was flying over India, of course. And they didn't allow the plane to land in Delhi. I think it landed in Calcutta, and they didn't allow the president to step out of the plane. Basically, they refueled the plane and sent it along to Nepal. I think this was in '58 or something like that, around about that time. And when India had a food shortage, when the Israelis said we are going to send grains, Nehru asked them to please not stamp the menorah, the state symbol, on the sacks of rice or whatever they were sending, grains they were
How
sending.
nice.
Yeah. So I mean, like, yeah, I have no words for this. It's just absolutely shoddy behavior, in my opinion. But the only reason I can think of is that the Indians felt, or the Indian leadership felt, that by being close to the Palestinians, perhaps they can negate Pakistan's Islam card and get closer to the OIC, for example, and create sympathy among the Islamic nations, and that would hurt Pakistan. Now, if it worked, that would have really undermined Pakistan, I agree, but we all know it had no chance of working. And in the sense, we see the progression at no
Yeah.
level, at no point can we say, well, India almost achieved this, but then last minute something happened. No, at no point was India taken seriously by the OIC, for example. Even membership was an issue. The Pakistanis, even
True.
though Indians had more Muslims, India was still kept out of it. These sorts of things.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, one last question, and I think we've touched upon this partially in our podcast on nationalism and Hindu nationalism too. But Harsh has asked, what can the Hindutva movement learn from Zionism?
Quite a lot of things. Now, see here, again, another kind of nationalism, Zionism, that we can talk about is cultural Zionism. The people like Ahad Ha'am, his name was Asher Ginsburg, for example, where he said that, look, having a Jewish state is not enough unless the Jewish culture survives, the religion, the traditions survive. So, an atheistic state where Jews live is not enough. The point is for our civilization, the Jewish civilization, to thrive. That means you have to revive our traditions and our culture as well. So for him, Zionism was, yes, we want, like, like I said, labor Zionism the same way, right? They said we want Israel, and then it should be in a socialistic sort of pattern. Cultural Zionists would say we want a Jewish state, of course, because nowhere else can we achieve this. No other country allows us to do this. But once we have Israel, it has to focus on our heritage, our culture, so that it can survive. Cultural Zionism. Now,
True.
Hindutva can definitely learn from that. Like, one of the things, even today, is that most of us, we go straight into engineering and medicine, the typical Indian sort of things. And we always say because the Indian market is such, and we have these excuses. But I would like to remind you that despite all the persecution and the pogroms and all these sorts of things, that the Jews never stopped creating phenomenal philosophers and musicians and these sorts of intellectual figures, like Moses Mendelssohn, for example, Spinoza, for example, right?
Mhm.
So the point is, even in that extreme situation where you're living in basically hostile territory, they still produce these people. So this argument that the Indian economy cannot sustain someone who studied Indian Hindu philosophy, I find that no, I mean there is a point to it, but I think that something that people have to really consider, like overcoming and getting past that sort of stuff. So in that sense, the Zionist sort of emphasis, even atheists are very committed to preserving a Jewish cultural heritage, whatever. They might argue what is
True.
the role of the rabbi, how much power a rabbi should have. That stuff they'll argue, but nobody's going to deny that. Nobody will say there shouldn't be a rabbi. So,
Hmm.
in that sense, the Zionists have done a very good job of keeping their Jewish culture alive in
Yeah.
many ways. This is something I find weak. Although, to be fair, again, it is improving. It has improved over the last, say, 10 years that I have paid any attention to the Indian scenario. It has improved, but there's a long way to go, primarily because we're a much bigger country and a much bigger population. But this is something. The other thing is also, you'll notice, like, I'll give you an example. For example, the Alta Lena was a crisis, state crisis, about who has power in Israel. Right after the formation of Israel, what happens is, a ship called the Alta Lena comes with weapons, and Menachem Begin, who is in charge of it, decides that he wants to distribute the weapons among his followers. And Ben Gurion says, "Look, back in the day, I might have kept quiet. I don't know, but today Israel is formed. So you bring in weapons, you give it to the Israeli army, and we will distribute it. Your men, my men. There's no such thing. We're all Israelis. We're all one." And and there was this. It almost, there's a gunfight or something, but then there was this belief. They said, "Look, no, Jews can't fight Jews. Jews should not do this to other Jews." This attitude was there. Now, is it always followed? No, of course not. That's an ideal sort of form. Or for that matter, there's this there's a saying, what is it? Kol Israel arevim zelazeh. All Israel, or all Jews are responsible for one another. This is brotherhood, this ties. These sort of, this common bond is there. Hindus have no such bonds. I mean, first of all, the whole caste business is like one chaotic mess, which I don't understand. But beyond that also, whether you want to keep the caste system or modify the caste system or do away with it, regardless, the sense of a common Hindu identity is like just very difficult to create. The Jews, for all their differences, and there are differences like the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, the Mizrahim, there are these differences. Despite all that, there is a sense that we're all one at the end of the day. And that is the one thing we should learn, preserve, protect, and spread our heritage, our culture among ourselves, not to proselytize, I'm saying. And the second part I'll say is that the sense of oneness, that unity. Indians, we are so divided, and this is the history of India. Like, how did we get conquered? Because we supported the outsiders against our own people.
I agree. In fact, the one thing, before we wrap things up, I just wanted to make a few comments about the connection between Hindutva and Zionism. The biggest problem is that people don't realize somewhere down the line, I think at a fundamental level, Judaism is still a monotheistic religion, and there is a difference between the fundamental building blocks of a dharmic system and a Judaic system, and that I think leads to a lot of confusions. And I don't think, I personally, we can take a lot of inspiration from Zionism, but I think Hindus eventually will have to come up with their own system of creating a sense of unity, because I think it's not like early Judaism did not convert. Jews stopped converting. There's a huge difference. So people get confused that Jews don't convert does not mean Judaism did not allow conversions. There's a huge difference between the two. Where in Hinduism, the conversion thing just does not scripturally come up in our brains. There's a huge difference there. So I think when it comes to a united Hindu identity, like I always propose something like a 3-pronged system of mutual respect, reciprocity, and Krishna's ahimsa, not Mahavir's ahimsa and Gandhi's ahimsa. I'm not talking about those types of ahimsa. I'm talking about where if you slap me, I'll punch you. But yeah, I'm not going to go out of my way to look for a fight. I'm not looking for a fight. So I think we will have to work on it in a very different way, because I think in terms of diversity, I'm not talking about racial diversity. I'm even talking about epistemic diversity at a memeplex level. We just have too much of diversity in India. I know current India is very Advaitin or very Bhakti movement inspired. But when we start, really finding ourselves in the true sense intellectually, I think we're going to see a lot of darshanas popping back up in India. You might see Uttar Mimamsa, Purva Mimamsa. I mean, I'm there now. I'm trying to revive Cārvāka. What are you going to do? So we have to deal with that. So this is where I feel we can take inspiration from them, but we'll have to work very strongly. What we can do is, where Savarkar, I think, had a point, was we can work with the democratic setup, and there we can try to create a political union of Hindutva while we have our social differences. I don't know. What do you think about it?
I think absolutely. In fact, I would say in terms of like a blueprint for a political sort of, like margdarshak sort of thing. It's exactly what Zionism in a way does. Israel is a democracy. Its democracy has never been threatened. And it's not like the Jews did not have any differences. In fact, you will see differences from day one. From the early moment of the state, there were several constitutional crises and these sort of things, but they resolved it through democratic means. And same way, we can do the same thing through open debate and everything. And of course, like for all the similarities, I'm not see. You can be very similar, but you are not the same, because if you're the same, then you'd have the same label also. The fact that you're two different labels means there is going to be some difference. So of course, I'm not saying that Jews and Hindus are the same. I am just saying that Jewish thinking might be closer to the Hindu way of thinking than the Christian and Islamic way of thinking in terms of cultural practices. Then many people realize. That's all I'm saying. And yes, we are different, but those differences are minuscule. And at this point, they are just so far ahead that we don't really need to concern ourselves with these minute points unless we are scholars. But from a political perspective, whether it's relations with
Fair
Israel
enough.
or whether it's, understanding like how Ben Gurion and Herzl and all these people mobilized for their political cause, in this sort of stuff, we really don't need to bother ourselves with these minuscule differences at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, I think it's time to wrap things up. I've actually taken a little bit more of your time than I was supposed to, but that's how these questions are. It's such a huge subject that we can never cover it in, even in 10 hours, to be very honest. That's how complicated it is. So, first
Absolutely.
of all, yeah. So, Jaideep, once again, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's always a
Thank you.
pleasure to talk to you, man. And let's see. So, let's wait for the response to this podcast. Let's see how people say, and then maybe in the future we can dig deeper into specific areas of Zionism or Judaism or just Israel in
India's
general, and we
relations,
can,
yeah.
yeah, so and we can do it. So once again, man, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Fun talking. You have very interesting topics in your podcast.
Right. All right, guys, time to wrap things up. You know the drill. If you like what I'm doing over here, please subscribe to the podcast, like the video, share your comments too on YouTube. Also, if you like what I'm doing over here, you can join the YouTube membership program. Just to let you guys know, I'm gonna have the AMA with all the 399 tier, members by the end of this month. Most probably will be the last week. I'll be posting it on the YouTube page. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Cārvāka. And if you're watching it on YouTube right now, you see the link on the screen too. And on that note, I'll end things for today. Until then, namaste, goodbye, see you next time.